One of the things that you want to pay attention to when they're scratching, and you can evaluate this far into the growing season, would be planting depth as well. Here's a couple of spikes here, just below the surface. Here's the surface. This was planted on the 19th, I believe, right? So it's always good to take a look at that. It's a little easier to evaluate once the corn is at spike or above the ground soil surface, because then you just measure down to the seed from the soil surface, the length of the mesocotyl. You want at least 1.5 inches to maximize root development. 2 inches is better than 1.5 inches as far as when they take things to yield. 2 inches is a little higher yielding than 1.5 inches, 1.75 inches. And of course, the ground always settles after we plant, so if you're planting at 1.75 inches, you can figure on about 1.5 inches here. So let's see where we're at. We're probably going to be in that inch and a quarter area once this emerges here, just kind of guessing at the planting depth on this particular seed. And then also make sure you take a look at the rows adjacent to the wheel tracks, because that ground firms up as the tractor rolls over it. Usually plants a little bit shallower, so those rows right around your wheel tracks or tractor tracks may want to adjust accordingly, another notch deeper or so, just to make sure. So something to watch when they're planting out there and the ground's really mellow and fluffed up. Want to make sure that we take into account that settling effect, where we're going to get 1/2 inch of settling on the soil, so we end up at least that 1.5 inches minimum. And here again, seed will come up a little bit quicker, planted shallower, but what we compromise is the root mass later on with that shallower planting depth. And that tends to compromise yield a little bit, depending on how dry it gets later on in the growing season. Well, when you evaluate seedlings at this point, you want to check for 3 or 4 things. You want to make sure that all 3 components, the radicle is there, the seminal, and of course the spike. And make sure that they're white and healthy and not discolored. The other thing you want to look at is the firmness of the seed. You want to make sure that seed is not water soaked, it's nice and firm when you squeeze it. And these are all in pretty good shape here. So we've got so far so good on this field here, planted before April 17th. Everything seems to be developing pretty normally, pretty uniformly. And of course, it pays to dig in more than one spot just to make sure that, especially looking at different soil types, how things develop across your heavy, your medium, and your later soils within a field. So when you look at soil type texture and organic matter differences, you can see the crusting potential here is quite a bit higher. That's where the rotary hoe would be helpful on a more variable field. I'm digging right between the 2 wheel tracks here. This is the row between the 2 wheel tracks, so you get a little different right up on the gauge wheels as the soil is firmed up and pushed up from the tractor tires or tracks. Here again, planting depth is probably going to be about 1 inch here. Got good radical and seminal initiation here, and the spike is coming along just fine. So just make sure you take a good look at, especially after the corn is up, you can do a report card on each row on stand uniformity, of course your spacing, and planting depth. So this field was planted on the 22nd, Saturday I believe, the 22nd of April, and nice mellow, not crusted up hardly at all here. So here, yeah, we've got germination occurring, at least from a spike perspective here. thing we want to watch as we plant closer to those extreme cool down events will be if we have abnormal or normal root development. The radical and seminal initiation should be taking place here in the next day or two on the radical. You can see that the radical is growing right there, that radical root starting to grow out from the germ. So that looks good. And the seminal will come a few days later out of the germ, out of the other side here. Here again, looking at a combination of things. Look for insects, insect feeding, wireworm, seed corn maggot. The later we plant in May, the more likely we are to run into seed corn maggot feeding. That's normally the third week in May when they're feeding. So corn that's germinated and up and growing, spiked by the third week in May, normally misses that seed corn maggot window. A little heavier soil here in this field. I can just tell it picking away with my knife here. There, we found one. This one is just broken germ. See the shoot and the radical coming out the bottom. This one is just a little bit behind. Just breaking. There's the seed root and the spike just coming out the top of the seed there. After digging up a few more seeds here, you can see a little more variation in terms of the growth and development of these different seeds here. And that's probably the result of planting it a little bit closer to that cool down event, where some seeds handle that just a little bit better than others here at this point. Taking a look at 24th planting date, probably not going to see a whole lot of activity yet. As far as germination, we're probably a day or two ahead of the spike breaking. This is a real pythium-rich environment where you've got tight, waterlogged soils. Pythium attacks corn just like it attacks soybeans. Oh, we got a double here. Alright, double your pleasure there. Buy a little more extra seed. Doubles don't hurt you as bad as skips in terms of impacting yields, so just adds a little bit to the seed cost, but normally your doubles don't impact yield a whole lot out there. In these heavier, wetter areas, that firmness of that seed will become very important in terms of maintaining that food source, keeping disease out of that seed. Once that seed starts to rot, then the food source is gone, and seedlings stall out pretty quickly and just kind of sit there. They're alive, but there's no food for them. So in these heavier soils, that'll be something to keep an eye on where we planted. All right, so this would be 424 again, 37,000 out here. So put in a few extra. Nice aggressive shoot growth on this particular hybrid. All being at about the same growth stage. So that's looking good here. Well, just in summary here, when we're looking at emergence, germination and emergence at this point, a few things we want to make sure and pay attention to. One is at planting depth. The second is, did the seed fire with the cold temperatures? Is it growing actively now as we get into a period where we have good soil temperatures? And thirdly, making sure that all three components are growing actively: the shoot, the spike, the radical, and the seminal root. A lot of times the cold chill has an effect on one or two, or sometimes all three of those, where they start to grow and then they stop because of that damage incurred in the germ during that chilling period. So it looks like we've got good germination here across all these planting days from the 17th to the 25th. This is south of Waseca. Didn't get a lot of rain, which helps out, but at this point things seem to be actively growing, so we'll just have to keep looking for normal plant development over the course of the next 10 days as the corn spikes out of the ground. We'll see what we have for stand establishment. Looks good so far.